Hello and welcome to the Rome Center for Political Philosophy. I'm David Levy. I'm here with my colleague Anna Salonia. Buonasera, Anna.
Buonasera, David. Buonasera, Paul.
Today we have with us Paul Franco. Paul is professor of government at Bowdoin College. He's the author of books on Michael Oakeshott, Hegel, and Nietzsche, among other works. And today we're going to be talking about his new book entitled Rousseau, Nietzsche, and the Image of the Human, published by the University of Chicago Press. Paul, welcome to the Rome Center.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Paul, first of all, a general question about political philosophy, of which you are a scholar and teacher. In his book on education, the Émile, Rousseau lays down the rule that whenever we propose to learn a subject, we should ask the question, what is it good for? Or as Nietzsche puts it in one of his works, we should ask whether the subject is advantageous for life. So what is political philosophy good for? Why is it advantageous for life?
All right. Good starting point for this discussion. Let me begin, I guess, just by saying a little bit about the passages that you've just quoted to frame the question about what's political philosophy good for. You chose one from the Émile for Rousseau, and of course that passage comes at a certain point in the Émile, when Émile is kind of a young boy, just before he becomes interested in the opposite sex. And so that view of knowledge, I would say, belongs to a certain stage of Émile's development. So maybe I would hesitate to kind of generalize from that is what knowledge and philosophy are always for Rousseau. Likewise with the Nietzsche passage, which I think probably emanates from one of his earlier essays, The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life. And that passage or that outlook really, in my view, probably characterizes the earlier outlook of Nietzsche that he moves a little bit away from as he develops. And the reason I kind of make these somewhat pedantic points about the passages is they may suggest a more utilitarian view of philosophy than I think both Rousseau and either Rousseau or Nietzsche had. That I don't think either of them had quite as instrumental a view of knowledge or of philosophy as those quotes suggest. I say that especially about Nietzsche, for whom I think philosophy and knowledge itself is not, has a value in and of itself to a large extent. It's not completely detached from life, but as Nietzsche's philosophy develops, as his thought develops, he seems to take more and more seriously that a kind of happiness that rests on error or delusion is not something that modern people should pursue or or can possibly be satisfied with. So you get, especially in his middle writings, aphorisms with titles like "Life as a Means to Knowledge" rather than the other way around, or we have a new passion for knowledge that won't allow us to rest satisfied with a happiness that rests completely on illusion or delusion. So I think for Nietzsche, especially, philosophy has a status that goes beyond just the narrowly instrumental. I think of a passage from Leo Strauss in this regard. One of my favorite lines of Strauss's on Nietzsche is, it goes like this: no philosopher has spoken so eloquently or nobly about philosophy and the philosophic life than Friedrich Nietzsche. I would say something along the same lines with Rousseau. I don't think it's quite as clear. I think Rousseau generally, he doesn't talk as much about philosophy per se as certainly Nietzsche does. And oftentimes his references to philosophy are quite pejorative, and insofar as it is kind of useless. But even with Rousseau, I'd point to a work like The Reveries. We were chatting a little bit about this before, but if you look at a work like The Reveries, you do begin to see something like an appreciation for knowledge for its own sake. When he talks about botany, for example, and the pleasures and satisfactions derived from going around looking at plants and classifying them. I think that is not only suggests this love of knowledge for its own sake, but is maybe a metaphor for the joys and pleasures of philosophy. So all of that is just to kind of maybe add a slightly different wrinkle to the original formulation of the question. Nevertheless, I guess I would come back and say it is undoubtedly clear that Rousseau and Nietzsche hope to have make a practical difference with their philosophies. They are not mere interpreters of the world. They do, I think in both cases, they want to change the world. They both want to, in that regard, change the objects of our esteem, to change our values in fundamental ways. And in that respect, I think political philosophy serves a role that has the kind of practical difference-making impact that you kind of drew attention to in the question itself. You know, I know I as I listened to the question, I wasn't sure whether you were talking about simply Rousseau and Nietzsche or whether you meant me as well, and what I think philosophy is good for. And the latter question would be a very big question indeed, and probably one I'm not entirely qualified or prepared to answer. But I suppose
I did mean that. I did mean also what you, as a scholar and teacher of political philosophy, what you think is the answer to the question, why should we study political philosophy?
And you know what? The reason I've delayed in getting to what I think was the thrust of the question is that I'm a little torn on this one. And you know, I guess I would say, you know, I've traveled some distance over the course of my career as a scholar and teacher. You know, beginning by writing some books on Oakeshott and Hegel, whom I would put in the camp of contemplative. Political philosophy for both Hegel and Oakeshott is primarily for the purpose of understanding the world and ourselves. They want to interpret the world, not necessarily change it. And of course, at the very least in Hegel, that's because he didn't think there was much to change in the world, that reason had already manifested itself in the world, and it was left to the philosopher to really just kind of make that intelligible to everybody. So as I moved from those early interests in Hegel and Oakeshott, I moved to people like Rousseau and Nietzsche, who have a very different, much more practical interest in changing the world. Part of that, I think, is springs from their not being terribly satisfied with the way the world is. Do not agree with Nietzsche. I mean, with Hegel, that the world is as it ought to be. And, I would say, insofar as I've moved to these authors as my focal interest, I think I'm more in that camp. Still torn, still think understanding the world is important and satisfying, but not necessarily enough. And I think Rousseau and Nietzsche are excellent guides for how we might rethink the world in order to reorder it.
Anna, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I do. I totally agree. I wanted to say, and it's really interesting because even the fact that you're trying to understand the world and you might discover potentialities and things that goes beyond the present or the state of things. So yeah. My question is, to what extent does the subject matter of your book concede with the subject matter of political philosophy as you understand it?
Thanks for the question. Well, the book, as you know, my book doesn't really take up Rousseau's or Nietzsche's political philosophies until the very last chapter. So as far as political philosophy proper or narrowly understood, there's much of my book that falls outside of that domain. So the earlier chapters, deal with their critiques of modern society, the genealogies of the corruption that they associate with modernity, their views or conceptions of human fulfillment, self-realization, and of course their understanding of women and the relationship between women and men. So there's a lot more than politics narrowly construed in there. But of course, for me, that's what political philosophy should be. That is to say, it at its best, it doesn't necessarily confine itself to simply matters of government or constitutions. That it has to take in the whole human experience to really understand the place of politics in that constellation. And that's why I like, in some ways, I think that's what draws me to Rousseau and Nietzsche. I think what's so appealing about them is that they are such comprehensive thinkers, that they deal with almost everything, and they're not the only ones in that who do that, but I think they're kind of exemplary in the range and comprehensiveness of the topics that they deal with and see as relevant in some ways to, how we ought to live our lives, which I see as ultimately what political philosophy makes a contribution to.
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned The Meal, which should be a book about education, but then it's a book about life, about political philosophy, if you want to.
Absolutely. Yeah, and to think of another book that Rousseau in the Emile mentions, but which it resembles in this regard is, of course, Plato's Republic. It's a book. Plato's Republic is it's a lot about much more than the ideal republic. It's about education. It's about ethics. It's about epistemology and theory of knowledge. It's got the whole thing in there.
So, Paul, let's come back to your book. I want to ask you to tell us what your book is about exactly, and kind of what the main argument of the book is. But before I get to that, I'd like to preface it with another question, which is, if I could play the devil's advocate for a minute, why is this book even legitimate? What I mean is, today we hear a lot about the need for inclusiveness and the need to give a voice to people who are part of groups that have been marginalized. That's the phrase that's used. You've written a book about two male Europeans, Rousseau and Nietzsche, and you've used the term the image of the human as if to suggest that these dead European males can tell us what the human is. So I think some people today might wonder whether this isn't presumptuous to write a book called The Image of the Human, in which the only thinkers you consider are from this narrow European group. What about that objection from the point of view of inclusiveness? Aren't you leaving out women and people of color? What about their views on however intelligent Rousseau and Nietzsche were, they were not women and they were not people of color, for example, not to mention other marginalized groups. So this objection, I think, could be raised against your book. I'd like to hear how you would respond to that. And then I'd like you to tell us, please, again, what your book is about and what your main argument is.
Well, that is a question that I get asked a lot by my colleagues and by my dean. And it's a question that seems to be getting louder and louder with every year I spend in the academy. So it deserves an answer. Definitely deserves an answer. And I suppose my answer would be that my interest in and this may kind of go to the second part of your question first, just to set up my answer to the first part of your question. The book is about these, is kind of driven by this, what interested me in these authors is that they level what I think are two of the most profound critiques of of modernity and modern Enlightenment society. And they also don't merely level critiques, but they also propose certain kind of positive solutions to the very problems that they diagnose. So, I think these at that general level, there is something there that remains of interest to us, regardless of whether we're men or women or people of color or not. I think that in some ways this feature of at least European or Western life, is something that remains with us today, and is an urgent problem that has not lost any of its urgency, again, regardless of our identity. I do think that in some ways these two thinkers, they are Europeans. They are, in some ways, I would grant you that their views on their image of the human is very much one that arises from a European and a particular European experience at a particular moment in its history. And in that respect, it can't claim to be definitive, across all cultures and all times. So that's the at least the European, how I would respond to the potential critique that this is just European or Western rather than more global and multicultural than that. The woman question, the fact that it definitely comes from a male standpoint, I would respond to by saying that, again, the sorts of questions, problems that they expose and the solutions that they bring to bear on those problems, I think should be of interest and of relevance and to some extent persuasive for women as well as men. The one area where I think the maleness of Rousseau and Nietzsche, really does show a certain limitation would be in their views on women and the family and the relationship between men and women. And, there, I think it would be hard to deny that not only do their arguments or their views reflect a very male bias, but that it's a limiting one as well. So I think the fact that they're males in some ways doesn't make is not decisive about much of their philosophy and many of the problems and solutions they bring to bear, but it certainly is relevant to their treatment of the relationship between the sexes, which, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit later, but at least in Rousseau, looms very large in his philosophy. It's not as if that is just a little detail in his philosophical outlook. It's a little less central to Nietzsche, but not unimportant either. That may not. And would you like to hear a little bit more about the argument of the book?
I would.
And so as far as the argument of the book is concerned,
For people who haven't read it and want to know whether they should read it, tell us kind of what is your main point, and why did you write the book?
Right. Well, this is a lot of pressure because obviously the number of sales of the book is going to be contingent on answering this. Give me a good answer to this question.
This video will be watched by millions.
Yeah. So
lots of pressure.
So for me, the interest of this book, well, first of all, I think very much at the forefront of my writing this book was just the fact that these two writers, in my view, do level in some ways the most profound, the most searching, most penetrating critiques of modern society, and therefore, each of them warrant attention for that reason. Why bring them together, I suppose, is the more important question here. And I suppose the answer to that question is that while they do both come together insofar as they have take a critical position with respect to society and also a constructive, try to come up with a constructive response to it, there is a way in which there are important differences between them. And those differences, to me, encapsulate a great deal of European intellectual history from the 18th century through the 20th century. That there's a way in which, by looking at Rousseau and Nietzsche, you can kind of see fundamental shifts in the kind of moral landscape of modernity And I wanted to bring that out by examining these two authors. And, you know, in some ways, when I phrase it that way, it does tilt things a little bit to Nietzsche. It suggests that in some ways, the movement of history has been one that can be encapsulated in the movement from Rousseau to Nietzsche, and that insofar as Nietzsche comes a little bit later and expresses the terminus of that movement, he might be the more relevant thinker for us. And I think there is a little bit of that teleology in this book. I think I ultimately try to make the argument, not only are there some important similarities, some fundamental differences, but with respect to the differences, at the end of the day, I find Nietzsche to be the more compelling thinker. But I do try to give Rousseau his due too. I do think that there's, without being too historicistic about this and simply giving the prize to the author who comes later or after, I think I do try to bring out that there are things in Rousseau's critique of modern society and some of his solutions that, you know, still retain a certain purchase, have a certain purchase for us. And therefore, though I incline toward Nietzsche, I by no means want to completely settle the question between these two authors.
Can you tell us more about that point you just made? What was Rousseau's, in a nutshell, if possible, and this is a big question, what was Rousseau's critique of modernity, and why should we today, a couple of centuries later, still pay attention to it?
So Rousseau's critique, I think, revolves around essentially the unfreedom of modern human beings, and that unfreedom is reflected in our dependence on others, and especially on the opinions of others, creating a human being that is alienated from himself, hypocritical, and ultimately inauthentic. That Rousseau's critique, in other words, revolves around this figure that he was the first to pejoratively refer to as the bourgeois human being, who is, and here I don't think one can improve upon Alan Bloom's description of the bourgeois, namely the human being who, when by himself or herself, is always thinking of other people, and when he or she is with other people, is always thinking about him or herself. And that kind of self-division and kind of floating between, you know, what we desire and what society expects of us is at the heart of Rousseau's critique. And did you ask about the solutions to his kind of response to that critique as well?
I would like to hear his response. I'd also like to hear your view on whether, to what extent is this relevant to us today? If Rousseau were to come back to life today in 2022, looking around, would he have the same critique? Are we still divided? Are we still bourgeois in his sense of the term?
You know, I think it still rings very true today, and certainly my students, when they read Rousseau, the first discourse or the second discourse, you know, find much in there that resonates with their experience. In the age of social media, you know, what could be more relevant than Rousseau's kind of criticisms of people who are so constantly thinking about how other people think about them that they completely lose sight of who who and what they are. So I think there's a lot, you know, that's why we continue to read Rousseau, and why Rousseau continues to be, you know, I think an author that really speaks to young people today. You know, I often, when I teach Rousseau, and I teach Rousseau a lot, you know, oftentimes in surveys of modern political philosophy, he's an author that, you know, does sometimes, you know, hit the students much more viscerally than John Locke or Thomas Hobbes, or they do like Machiavelli, I have to say. So anyways, yeah, I think it retains a lot of its relevance today. However, you know, this raises the question about Nietzsche. You know, if Rousseau's critique still rings true today, you know, what is it? Does Nietzsche simply repeat the same points, or does the different critique that he makes add something that's missing in Rousseau? And the view that I take in the book is that I do think that Nietzsche's critique does not revolve so much about the inauthenticity, the hypocrisy of the modern bourgeois. That does not seem, you know, there's a bit of that in Nietzsche. It's probably more prominent in his earlier writings than his later writings. But at the end of the day, Nietzsche seems to be concerned with something different, namely the fact that the world has lost a certain kind of direction, aim, purpose, goal, and that consequently human beings are, you know, devoid of passion, energy, and their lives are devoid of meaning. So he brings into his critique really this idea of nihilism and the nihilistic character of the modern world that I don't think is in Rousseau so much, and I think is even more salient in some ways to our predicament today than even the kind of inauthenticity and self-division that Rousseau points to.
So what do you think would be Nietzsche's critique of modernity in particular? In the sense nowadays, what would
What it look like?
Yeah.
So again, I think, and I'm just going to pick up from where I left off. This question picks up nicely from where I just left off. That is to say, you know, his diagnosis of the modern world is that this is that we are aimless, goalless, purposeless. Our lives are meaningless and passionless. Those are a lot of words that have less at the end of them. And that is in some ways the heart of Nietzsche's point, that we're missing something very, very important. I think one of my favorite lines of Nietzsche to characterize the predicament of modern humanity is one that appears in The Antichrist, his book, The Antichrist, where he says, modern human being sighs, I know not which way to turn. I am everything that knows not which way to turn. You know, just to evoking this very aimless and purposeless, and to some extent relativistic situation that we find ourselves in. Where does that come from? And in the book, I try to, I think, I'm going to say something more general about Nietzsche and Rousseau here, and the way I wrote about them in the book. With respect to Rousseau, generally my presentation is not developmental. That is to say, I see Rousseau's work from the first discourse through the Reveries. and including the social contract and the Emile, as being largely consistent. So I don't feel the necessity to kind of chart the changes that he went through in his career. You will have noticed that my approach with Nietzsche is always different in that regard, that I tend to kind of see some fundamental changes or some big changes that take place over the course of his philosophical career. So with respect to this diagnosis of the problem of modernity that we're talking about, I do see an important shift in his writing. Early in his career, he seemed to trace this kind of nihilistic condition that we live in to the explosion or growth of the sciences, especially of the historical sciences, the historical sense. There's so much to know, and so much of that knowledge kind of sweeps over us to the point that we are completely disoriented and unable to know which way to turn. And you see that, of course, in The Birth of Tragedy, in the essay, The Uses and Disadvantages of History for Life, and some of those other earlier writings. I do feel that beginning with the middle writings of Nietzsche, beginning with Human All Too Human, Daybreak, and Gay Science, those are the three middle works conventionally categorized. You do begin to see Nietzsche putting more and more emphasis, less and less emphasis on science as the culprit and morality as the real culprit, and especially the morality of pity, what he sometimes calls herd morality, a kind of morality that receives its consummate political expression in democracy and socialism, so on and so forth. And of course, there, it's here his emphasis becomes kind of the mediocrity that comes from the morality of pity. And it too leads to a kind of aimlessness. There's really no more aspiration. There's nothing to sacrifice oneself for. There's nothing to that kind of gives meaning to our suffering. All of our energy seems to be placed on alleviating all that makes life difficult or uncomfortable or challenging, and therefore leads us to a rather unheroic mediocrity. So again, all of that is that describes a shift in Nietzsche's critique and the sources of the problem that he identifies. And again, all of that does, of course, suggest a fundamental difference with Rousseau. I mean, just where I've ended up, the fact that Nietzsche sees the morality of pity culminating in democracy as the real problem of the modern world. I mean, those are two things that Rousseau is hoping will be the solution to the very problems he identifies, that pity looms very large and compassion looms very large in Rousseau's solution to the problem of modern selfishness. And of course, democracy is very much at the heart of his political philosophy.
I on this point about on Nietzsche's critique of the smallness of modern man, that he has no high aspirations, he's the unheroic quality of the modern soul. The modern man has nothing to no high ideals that he would die for example, or sacrifice for. He's caught up in his own small comforts. The famous passage about the last man in Zarathustra. What about the fact that, what does he say about, I mean, as he knew in his own lifetime, there were still wars being fought in which people were still fighting for Germany, for example. There was Bismarck, yes. I mean, people were fighting and dying. And after Nietzsche's lifetime, a number of big wars were fought in which people did die for something greater than themselves. It doesn't look like all those young men who marched off to World War I and World War II, and so on, and all the other wars of the 20th century and 21st century, are they, from Nietzsche's point of view, are they last men seeking only their own comfort, motivated by a morality of pity? What does he say about the fact that, after all, politics does go on in modernity, and there are life and death issues, and etc.?
Yeah,
Are we last men? I mean, his arguments and his observations are undeniably powerful.
Yeah.
What I guess is are they definitive? Is that all we are?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I suppose one could even extrapolate to our own day. I mean, people seem to be full of passionate conviction at the moment. They don't seem to be devoid of causes that they're willing to sacrifice for. So very interesting question. And I'm not. I think it's a question that really. I think I could come up with a Nietzschean response to it, but I'm not going to say that Nietzschean response necessarily fully answers the question that you've asked, David. I think Nietzsche's response, and it was a response that, of course, he lived in the midst of some of those wars that were waged by Germany and France, and of course in the era of Bismarck, and in the era of what was known at the time as great politics. And Nietzsche has a lot to say about great politics. A great deal to say, and sometimes speaks out of both sides of his mouth on this issue. At least early on in his career, he was vehemently opposed to kind of the great politics, nationalistic great politics, socialistic great politics that he saw agitating the Europe of his day. So even he seemed to be aware that there was a kind of agitation, turmoil going on in the world that he was in which he was living. He tends to see that as somehow spurious or in some ways more symptomatic of the fact that the world has no longer any real meaning than an authentic or kind of assertion of meaning, that we live in a world that we're trying to manufacture in the absence of something real, something to get excited about. In this regard, his comments about European great politics, nationalistic and revolutionary, parallel his remarks about Richard Wagner's operas. Richard Wagner's operas, which are full of tremendous effects and swelling emotions. And Nietzsche more and more comes to see that as kind of the kind of fake production of effects, rather than something that springs from a genuine experience of meaning or purposefulness. I think that in some ways Nietzsche held to that view. I'm going to actually stick with this because it's more relevant to your question. I think he continues to to think in that way about a good deal of modern politics. So there's a great chapter in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where Zarathustra, visits. I think it's just before we kind of get Zarathustra's thoughts about the eternal recurrence, but he visits an island where there's this beast called hellish noise, and hellish noise produces all these kind of loud noises and is full of kind of sound and fury. But again, Nietzsche kind of sees at the heart of that, a kind of emptiness, that all that kind of activity and passion and conviction is a testament to kind of our emptiness, rather than some sort of genuine conviction. And it's in that connection that he says, the greatest thoughts are ones that don't produce great noises, but are the quietest thoughts, and it's around the most quiet and inaudible of thoughts that the world actually turns, rather than these more superficial blockbuster events.
Yes,
go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, it seems to me that Nietzsche's view is very singular, in the sense very individualistic, is connected to the self, in the sense of a singular self, an individual self, and so our ideas, if our strong ideas, are spontaneous and individualistic, but not in the sense of an egoistic self, but in the sense of spontaneous and authentic self, as you treat in your book.
And in that respect, not amenable to great politics, as we've been talking about it. And I think there is a lot to that, to exactly that point, Anna.
Paul, I think we should adjourn here our interview. You talked to us about the Nietzsche, Rousseau's and Nietzsche's critiques of modernity. Maybe in the future you will be willing to do a second part of the interview in which you can tell us about their respective solutions to these problems. So
I would be delighted to do so, especially if the questions are as good as the ones that you guys have raised today. So I would absolutely be delighted to do that.
All right, well, we thank you for joining us at the Rome Center, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, David.